We factored by grouping, and now we're factoring trinomials. So, this is the general setup that we're looking for when we're factoring trinomials. This A, B, and C are just constants, and the x's are variables in this case. So here our constants are A, B, and C. Our A would be 1, our B would be 7, and our C would be 12. It's called a trinomial because there's 3 terms here, right? So the way we go about factoring these is, first you gotta just notice if your leading coefficient is 1 or not. In our case it's a 1, so it's gonna be the easier case for us. If it's not a 1, it's just gonna be a little bit more harder, I guess, if you want to say that. It's just more work. Doesn't necessarily mean it's harder. But, so the first thing, you're factoring trinomials, you check to see if your A is 1 or not. So our A is 1, right? So, we're going to have to do less work. So the way you factor a trinomial is you open up 2 parentheses, and we could check our answer by foiling. But first of all, the way we're going to factor this is, we have an x squared here, right? So we could put an x term here and an x term here. When we FOIL this, we'll get back the x squared. So I'm assuming you guys are familiar with foiling. And then you put your focus on the c term, which is the 12 in our case. So I'm putting my focus on 12 right now. Then I think of 2 numbers that would multiply to give me 12 and add or subtract in a way to give me 7, right? So I think of all the numbers that multiply to give me 12. We have 3 times 4. That's just the first one I thought of. Not necessarily because it's the answer. It is the answer, but that's just the first one I thought of. I could have thought of 2 and 6 or whatever. I could have thought of 1 and 12, right? But it just happens that if we want to get a 7 out, we have to use this combination because 3 plus 4 would give me 7. So I'm going to put a 4 here and a 3 here, and whichever sign this middle term carries, the B, goes with the bigger number. So my bigger number is 4 here, so the positive will go there. I mean, in this case, since everything's positive, you don't have to worry about it. But as in the other examples that we're going to do, this will make much more sense. So since everything's positive here, you don't have to worry about the signs. So this is what the given example would be factored as, x plus 3 times x plus 4. And really quickly, just to show you that this is equivalent to that, we could just FOIL this out, right? This is how you would FOIL. So x times x, that would be x squared. X times 4, that would be 4x. 3 times x, that would be 3x. And 3 times 4 is 12. Combine these like terms right here. So you get x squared plus 7x plus 12. And indeed, that is what we started with. So that was just to check you that, because I said you could always check your answer when you factor. So that's how you go about doing these trinomials if your leading coefficient is 1. Okay, so another example, factoring trinomials. So, the first step is just to jump straight to the leading coefficient, which is a, and you want to see if that's a 1 or not. So in our case, it is a 1. So we don't have to worry about the other case, which I'm going to show you later. So if the leading coefficient is 1, we just open up our parentheses, because we know that when we FOIL this out, it'll be equivalent to what we were given. So we have an x squared, giving it x to each of these parentheses, because when I FOIL this out, I'll get the x squared term back. Now moving on to the c, that's where you want to put your focus on. So I want all the numbers that multiply to give me 6 that add and subtract in a way to give me negative 5x. So we have 1 and 6, and we have 2 and 3. So in the last example, I just said it was 3 and 4, and I just jumped right into it. But let's just experiment to see which one of these would be correct. So let's say we went with the first case, 1 and 6. So I'll put a 1 and a 6 here. I noticed that this last term is positive, and this middle term is negative. So if you've practiced FOILing a lot, you know that the only way that this guy could be positive is because when you FOIL, the last two things that you multiply together are the constants. It's the 1 and the 6. So that has to be positive. The only way you get a positive out is if you multiply two positives together or if you multiply two negatives together. So over here I see that I have a negative 5x. So in that case they both have to be negative. But let's see if that would give me my middle term, which is a negative 5x, right? You could FOIL this thing out if you'd like. There's a faster way to check. It's called the inter and outer check. I don't know if it's like an official thing. I just heard it around because I've been tutoring. So you take this inner guy and you multiply them together. So x times negative 1, that's negative x. Then you take these outer guys and you multiply them together. So negative 6 times x, that would be negative 6x. And then you add them together. So that would be a negative 7x, which is not what I have in the middle. So you would not go with that one. You would not go with that choice, right? That would be the wrong way to do it. Let me show you the right way to do it. So the x's wouldn't change, right? Now let's go with the 2 and 3 combination. We'll put a 2 here and a 3 here. We know that 2 and 3 would give me 6, but since this guy is negative, I know they both have to be negative, right? Because we said multiplying two positives would give you a positive, or multiplying two negatives would give you a positive. But the middle term's negative, so I made them both negative. Now let me do that inner and outer check to see if I get negative 5x out. So the inners, x times negative 2, negative 2x. The outers, negative 3 times x, negative 3x. Adding them together, I get negative 5x, which is indeed what I have in the middle. So this setup right here, x minus 2, x minus 3, would be the correct answer for this when we're asked to factor. And okay, so another trinomial, and then I will have you all try some. So we said the first thing is you go to the leading coefficient and you see if it's 1 or not, right? So it's a 1 in our case, so we don't have to worry about that. I said I'll show you the case where it's not a 1. So we said if it's a 1, you just jump to opening up the parentheses, right? Because we know when we FOIL that out, it'll be equivalent to that. That's how we're going to check to see if we factored correctly. Giving an x to each, because when I know when I FOIL, I'll get back the x squared. Focusing on the c now. The first thing is to focus on the a to see if it's 1 or not. Then your second step is to focus on the c. It's a 5. That negative, we'll worry about that later, but it's a 5. The good thing is that there's just 1 times 5. That's the only thing that would give me 5. So we don't have to worry about the case where is it this or that one, like the previous one I showed you. So you already know it's going to be 1 and 5. Then you got to start worrying about the signs. So they're both negative in this case, right? The only way, like I said, if you practice FOILing a lot, when you multiply the last two things together, it's going to be this 1 and the 5. And to get a negative out of that, one has to be a positive and one has to be a negative. That's the only way you get a negative out. So, this is the way I like to do it when I know that a negative's in there for sure. I look at this term, the middle term, and whatever sign it has, that sign will go with the bigger number. So since 5 is bigger than 1, this sign will go with the 5, and the opposite sign will go with the 1. And then you could do the inner and outer check, you could FOIL that out, but that's how this would factor. You really want to focus on the C. That's the most important part. If it's negative, that means you're going to have a plus and a minus. If it's positive, it's either going to be all plus or all minus. Alright, so, I think I've done enough examples to the point where you guys could try this on your own. But I'm still going to go over it with you, so either way, you're winning. Alright, so, the first thing we said is jump to the leading coefficient, which is A, in our case, which is 1. And then we said if it's 1, just jump straight to what we've been doing, because if it's not 1, I'll show you what to do in another video. But if it's 1, if the leading coefficient is 1, we could just straight open our parentheses up. x squared, so we'll get an x to each of these guys. Now jump to c, that's the next important thing, which is 6. But the problem with 6 is there's like 2 different ways I could go about doing this. 1 or 6 or 2 and 3. And let's see, to get a 7 out, 2 and 3 would never give me a 7 out. Adding or subtracting in any kind of way on earth, right? 1 and 6 would. Since everything's positive here, you don't have to worry about it. Everything will be positive. So that's how it would factor, guys. X plus 1 and x plus 6. And you could FOIL that, inner and outer check, whatever you like, to see that this is equivalent to that when you FOIL it. Okay, so another example. I'm assuming you've already tried it, so I'm just going to try to tack this thing right away. So first thing we said is look at the leading coefficient, which is a, right? If your a is 1, we said we could just do the normal thing that we've been doing, just jump to our normal procedure. Because we said we'll look at the case where a is not 1 in another video. So we do that. Then we look at c, which is 10. Negative 10, but we'll worry about the negative later. So it's 10, and we know the numbers that'll give me 10 when you multiply them together are 1 and 10 and 2 and 5. Then you put your focus in on this b term, which is a negative 3, or just 3 in general, right? So would 1 and 10 add or subtract in any way to give me 3? No way, right? So it has to be 2 and 5. So 2 there and a 5 there. Okay. Now, this guy's negative, right? This last term, which is c, is negative. That means, like how I said, if you've been FOILing a lot, you know that the last 2 things you multiply together are going to be these 2 constants here. So to get a negative out, you have to have a positive and a negative, right? So you're going to have the 2 signs case happening here. So I said when that happens, you just take the sign of the middle guy and you give it to the bigger number. So the bigger number in this case is 5. So it's going to get that sign. And 2 would get the opposite sign. So that's how you would factor that. Because we knew that c was a negative, and we knew that came from a positive being multiplied to a negative. So that's how you would factor this trinomial.